A couple of years ago, my colleague Emily Raravan gifted everyone on the Cooks Illustrated team with a mini painting of their favorite recipe. Here's what she painted for me. It's Brian Roof's Catalan beef stew. It's the perfect braise. Super tender bites of beef in a rich, bright, garlicky sauce. It's got some texture to it. It's so good. It also happens to be a great model for how braising works. Braising is a hands-off cooking method that simultaneously cooks the food and makes a sauce from the juices released. All good braises stick to a formula. Choose the right cut of meat, make a flavorful braising liquid, cook until that meat is tender, and then turn the liquid into a sauce. Let's take a look. You can braise vegetables, fish, or tender cuts like a chicken breast, but it's tough cuts that benefit the most from this cooking technique. What makes some cuts tough and others tender? Let's take a look at two muscles. We've got a fillet, which comes from the back, and a boneless short rib, which comes from the upper back shoulder region. Which do you think gets more work? If you said the short rib, you're right. If we zoom in on a fillet and a short rib, you'd see that even though the muscles in both are made up of bundles of fibers sheathed in collagen, there's a big difference. The more work a muscle does, the more tightly bound the collagen strands are to each other. An abundance of cross-linked collagen is what makes some cuts of meat tough. Before we get to tenderizing, we're going to need to get our braise going. This Catalan beef stew calls for boneless short ribs. I'm looking to get rid of the excess fat. It's either remove it now or defat after cooking. After that, I just want to trim them into 2-inch pieces. Typical braises call for browning the meat. In fact, there's almost always a browning step because Maillard browning is delicious. We're building the fond for the braise by carefully browning the sofrito. This step starts with gently caramelizing onions. I just want to season these with some salt, and I want to bump up the browning by adding a tiny bit of sugar. Now, these onions are going to take about 40 minutes to caramelize, and patience is the name of the game. Taking the time to develop a rich fond in any braise is critical because that fond flavors the sauce. It's been 40 minutes and those onions have really cooked down and picked up a lot of color. Now we can add the rest of the sofrito ingredients. I've got tomato, a bay leaf, and some smoked paprika. At this point, these tomatoes are going to need a little bit of time to cook down too. You can see there's a nice dark fond that's forming on the bottom of the pot, and it's time to get the rest of our sauce ingredients in. I've got water, wine, a nice sprig of thyme, and some cinnamon. A quick scrape to bring the fond up from the sides and the bottom of the pot. So now that this braising liquid is done, we can move on to the meat. The boneless short ribs for this recipe are seasoned, and then they go in the pot. At this point, I'm just going to bring the heat up to high to get that liquid up to a simmer, and once it's nice and steamy, this will go in the oven. Oven braising is more foolproof than braising on the stovetop. It calls for temperatures in the 300 to 350 degree range. That keeps the liquid in the pot at or just below a simmer so that the meat cooks gently without us having to worry about food at the bottom of the pot charring. After that, there's not much to do until the meat is tender. Why do recipes tell you to cook until tender rather than giving a temp? It's because this is one of those cases where a thermometer won't give you enough information. Take a look at these two pieces of beef. They kind of look the same. They both temped out at 190 degrees, but one of them sat there for a lot longer. I pulled this one out of the pot after about an hour of cooking, and even though it hit 190, you can see how tough it is. This one, on the other hand, I pulled it out after 2.5 hours of cooking. The temperature stayed the same, but actually, I don't even need this fork. Check this out. Spoon tender. How great is that? So how come the temperature is the same, but the texture is so radically different? It's all about that collagen that we touched on earlier. Cooking can break down the cross-linkages that bind collagen strands to each other, and those individual collagen strands, more cooking can break each one of them down into tender gelatin. There's no magic temperature where any of these steps happens, though. The process begins around 140 degrees, and it goes fastest between 160 and 180 degrees. Even after the meat gets into those ranges, the process still takes time. That's why the beef's texture changes dramatically, even though the temperature is constant. The best way to check for doneness when you're braising is to use a fork or a knife to feel out the texture of the meat. This is one of those few cases where a thermometer isn't all that helpful. Time to move on to the final step, finishing the sauce. First up is defatting. A little bit of fat is great for flavor and consistency, but too much obviously makes the sauce greasy. You could use a spoon to skim off the fat or a fat separator. If you're doing that, you want to make sure to give the fat time to separate before you decant the sauce. In this recipe, though, we took the time to trim the meat well before cooking, so we can skip this step. Once we've dealt with the fat, we want to concentrate the flavors. Meat releases liquid during cooking, and simmering evaporates that excess liquid to intensify the flavors. This recipe folds a reduction step in by having us braise with the lid off. Other recipes are going to ask you to remove the meat and let the liquid simmer. Reduction also increases viscosity, but most recipes are going to have you do it more directly by whisking either cornstarch or flour in. The exact ratio of thickener is going to depend on your desired consistency. You do want to make sure that the flavors are pretty close to what you want before you thicken. This stew is thickened with a piccata, which is a mixture of toasted almonds, toasted bread, garlic, and parsley. They're finely ground, and we just stir them in at the end. Along with the piccata, I'm also adding some sautéed oyster mushrooms. Finally, make sure to taste the sauce and adjust the flavors with salt, spices, fresh herbs, and acid, or sometimes a pinch of sugar really helps. Here, I'm going to be seasoning with salt and pepper. Ooh, finally, time to eat. This has smelled so good during the braising, but it's going to taste even better. This is my platonic ideal of a braise. It's nutty, it's rich, it's got like a hint of garlic and just this sofrito sweetness. Oh, delicious. Braising's got a great ROI. The way to maximize that return is to start with a tough cut, make a base for the braising liquid, cook until the meat is tender, and adjust the flavor and consistency. After that, just dig in. I love this dish so much. Thanks, Brian. Do you have a favorite braise? Does it follow this formula? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like or share it with a friend, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.